Okay, guys, so this week we are investigating Cubism and looking at some of the sort of not only beginnings of Cubism with Pablo Picasso and Braque, but also kind of looking at some of the issues with Cubism as well, revolving again around primitivism and these ideas we've talked about the last couple of weeks. So, right now at this time, we have modern artists rested on the brink of total abstraction in 1910. So we have very much Picasso and Braque coming very close to having sort of the purest sense of abstraction, and we're going to see it very soon with modern artists. But we're going to focus on Cubism today. So with Expressionism and Fauvism, we saw that Matisse liberated color, line, form, and space from their status as mere tools for documenting the visible world. Kandinsky invested in the spiritual realm of art and contemplating of music and creation. And Kandinsky bringing abstraction from purely his imagination versus for most avant-garde artists working in the early 20th century, though, abstraction was simply a means of distilling to its essential qualities from observed in the real world. So we see Kandinsky and other artists really getting to sort of the brink of abstraction, and Cubism is a part of that as well. So Pablo Picasso and Braque were questioning the way in which reality was represented, the physical world and weak abstraction. Rather than challenging the significance of material world, Cubists questioned the means by which this reality was understood and represented. Henry Bergson writes the theory published Matter and Memory of 1896. Consciousness is an accumulation of experiences. In other words, no rational being can experience a single instant of time. The past, present, and future are not separate moments of awareness, but an unbreakable continuum or an experience of duration. So with sort of Albert Einstein publishing his theory of relativity, as well as these other sort of concepts about the fixed nature of space and time not really existing, we're going to see Picasso play with some of those ideas in Cubism so that you have multiple views and multiple moments all combining together into one work. We're going to see that Cubism is going to influence movements like Suprematism, Dada, Constructivism, Gestalt, and Art Deco. Cubist painters rejected the inherited concept that art should copy nature or the artist should adopt the traditional techniques of perspective, modeling, and foreshortening. They would emphasize the two-dimensionality of the canvas, reduce and fractured objects into geometrical forms, and again, multiple contrasting vantage points. So again, Braque and Picasso are really the establishers and developers of the Cubist movement because of their mutual relationship. You'll see in 1908 to 1912, Braque and Picasso are constantly working off one another. When one paints something, the other paints something. They're constantly sort of contradicting or fighting in this sort of artistic way that pushes one further as they keep going back and forth between the two. Whereas Picasso was impulsive, prolific, and anarchic, Braque was slow, methodical, and meditative. And so we're going to think about them separately, but we'll also see how they connect to one another as well. So Picasso was born in Spain in 1881, and he very much sort of connected himself more with the city of Barcelona, where his family moved when he was 13 years old. And his father was a painter and gave him instruction. His father took a post in Barcelona's School of Fine Arts where Picasso was allowed to enroll, and so he was studying important works of Diego Velázquez at the Prado Museum. Picasso suffered serious poverty in Madrid and chafed under the strictures of academic education, and Barcelona was really trying to change its city and to make it more modern, so he's trying to sort of move in this period as well to sort of gain fame and money for himself as well. So he's painting in both Barcelona and then eventually Paris when he moves there. In 1900, his work was selected to be hung at the Spanish Pavilion of the Universal Exhibition in Paris. He was 19 years old then, and very shortly after that, his first painting is sold. This is him in Paris. Which is Les Moulins de la Gayette, 1900, oil on canvas, which is connected very much with Renoir's work that we also saw of the same location. So Bertha Wheel, who is Picasso's friend, is the first one to sell this work of his, and similarly to Renoir, he is depicting this dance bar or dance hall at the time where people come and gather, but instead of doing sort of the frilly sun dabbled daylight image, he instead goes for the nocturnal, considerably more sinister view that's much more tenebrous and maybe sort of nefarious as well. Bertha Wheel in her own right is very famous. She was the first female art dealer, and she owns the Gallery B. Wheel, called it a place of youth. She was very important as she was a Jew during this time and fought against a lot of anti-Semitism, along with giving a lot of these artists their very first sales, so Picasso being one of them, also Matisse and Modigliani. She was working with Picasso and sold his first painting before he was even in Paris. So she became very well known in the artistic community as being sort of this person who really helped artists get their start. And she very much refused to marry because she would lose power over her business, as she'd have to sort of give it over to her husband. And she never was she wasn't ever financially stable, and she did have to close because of World War II. But she was very monumental for giving Modigliani his first ever and only exhibition, which was closed down because of the horrific nudity, which we will talk about. I don't think we've talked about it yet. No. Which we'll talk about when we come back after the midterm. I couldn't find a really good image of this cartoon, but I think it's so funny. Showing sort of Bertha Wheel at the center here, and all the little artists that she helped train in the sort of dancing around her, Picasso being here on the right, as the little man that he is. She really became important, and they were very grateful for her, many artists, because she was really the first person to encourage a lot of these artists and to sell their first work, really helping them to move forward with their career. So Picasso is going to move to Paris and live with Carl Casagemas, who's on the far right here, and this is with their other friend in the center. And his friend is really going to be the inspiration for his blue period. As you know, or you may be familiar, Picasso goes through these particular sort of color scheme periods, and we're going to look at the blue and rose period before we move into Cubism. And his friend, Casagemas, was in love with this model, Germaine, and at his own sort of farewell party, he asked her to marry him, and she was already married and not really interested, and he had planned this party as kind of a farewell to himself, and it was an interesting time because a lot of these artists were all having sex with different models, Germaine being one of them, very much a time of sexual freedom in Paris, and he ends up shooting at Germaine and then shooting himself, and so after he dies, Picasso doesn't even go to his funeral, but apparently feels his death very strongly. And this is sort of the start of his blue period, in which he's sort of painting these somber works, which is interesting. But it also, I find it strange on the other hand, and we're going to talk about this a lot with Picasso, is that he's going to take up a relationship with Germaine himself, and move into the apartment with her, and have this sort of sexual relationship with her after his friend died from loving her so much. So, or supposedly. And she's going to later marry Ramon Pichet, who was a different artist in their circle. But, so when people talk about this blue period being inspired by his friend, it's a little curious to me that he sort of starts up this relationship with Germaine, and maybe that was part of the whole controversy in the first place. So the Blue Period, like I said, 1901 to 1904, he's living in Barcelona and in Paris, and he painted predominantly in a blue palette. So a lot of his works are figures and themes expressing human misery, including hunger, cold, hardships that he experienced while trying to establish himself. He connected a little bit with El Greco and Spanish physical torment. He also had some sensitivity to victims of modern capitalist society, which led him to join the Communist Party. And so you can sort of see in these two images, you have the Old Guitarist, which is a very popular work by Picasso, as well as his own self-portrait on the left, which is sort of supposed to be this cold, hungry, and disappointed portrait. La Vie is a work that is talked about in the book from 1903. This is sort of a gaunt couple here on the left, with on the right, you have this sort of stern gaze of a woman holding a baby, who emerged from studies that Picasso did of women's inmates in prisons who were sort of suffering from venereal diseases. But they are free models, and so he painted her specifically from an inmate. So the woman on the right is clothed in this sort of heavy drapery, gives her sort of this timeless appearance of a Madonna, even though she's kind of embodying this contradictory view of woman as either like a saint or seductress. We don't really know like what kind of figure she is. Is she positive? Is she negative? Versus on the left with these two nude figures, very much seems like the shaming of Adam and Eve when they are rejected out of the Garden of Eden. And the scene as a whole sort of brings this like blue coldness to the imagery, right? The coldness of the skin, it looks sort of like death. So very much sort of this sad, depressing vision of maybe a Madonna, an Adam and Eve figure, and sort of what this could interpretively mean about his work. Originally, he painted the man's portrait as a portrait of himself, but later changed it to his friend who had died, Castigamos. During this time, in about 1904, Picasso is going to move into this place on Montmartre Hill called Laundry Boat, which is this area here in Paris. And he lived there with sort of an ever-growing circle of friends, of painters, poets, and actors and critics. And it became this very popular place for people to meet. It wasn't necessarily very wealthy, but it was this sort of high art area in Paris at the time. So this is what it looks like today. This is from 1910. And this is where Picasso stayed and had his studio. During that time, he paints Woman with a Crow, and it's this very sort of macabre pastel in which a woman is grotesquely sitting with these kind of creepy long fingers and tall shoulders. And she sort of kisses this raven, and the subject very much evokes Edgar Allan Poe and the sort of dark and creepiness and sinister idea of this figure. And apparently this woman actually existed, and she was a woman who had trained her bird to pick up crumbs in a cabaret in Montmartre. And so Picasso here painted her in this very macabre scene. And you can see he's starting to give way to this blue period and move into his next period, which is called the Rose period. So moving into the Rose period, Picasso was very interested in saltimbanquis, which were sort of traveling acrobatic performers, and became sort of very interested with them, who were very rootless and had this kind of insecure existence on the margins of society, and liked to show them at kind of rest. And they were very sort of popular subject matter in France and Spain at the time. And he was visiting different circuses as well, and depicting these figures. This one on the left featuring Germain in it as well. This one also featured Picasso here as a sort of self-portrait as a saltimbanque. Cézanne was also interested in the topic as well. It was something that we saw in modern art, not something that I necessarily showed you before, but something that was occurring amongst other modern artists as well. Very sort of interested in this kind of rootless existence that these performers had, and very much again in connection with depicting performers in France. Now, as you may notice here, it's also Harley Quinn is another name for these traveling acrobats, which is where you get the name Harley Quinn from comic books as well. We also see Henry de Toulouse-Lautrec. Here's a version of his performers, as well as Daumier, which we talked about as well. Which is the family of Saltimbanquis from 1905, oil on canvas. And this was a really big work that he produced. He made a lot of different sketches and images before creating it. And the x-rays sort of reveal a lot of different compositions. It was kind of hard for me to find some images of this. I found some ideas from an article here that you could see. So versus these figures that are on the right, facing out to the right, they're originally facing out to the left, maybe would have looked like this. And you can sort of see this through the x-rays that they did on the paintings themselves. It was very strange for him to have taken this very large painting under his wing, an enormous ambition with such sort of a simple composition. That wasn't really something that people produce in this big of a sort of historic image. And you're going to see that with a lot of his work, where he produces these great masterworks that are on these massive canvases that don't really depict subjects that would have traditionally been on big canvases. In this image, this sort of stark landscape, he paints himself as the Harley Quinn here. So this is a self-portrait. And painted the rest of the figures based on his friends and family members. And this painting is very interesting because you have all of these figures, they're not really interacting with one another or connecting, and they're in this sort of dark and sad landscape. So you start to think what's sort of the turmoil or ideas that Picasso is trying to portray through these different elements of his work, like even this figure sort of staring off to the right, not paying attention to the rest of the figures. So what Picasso is focusing on with this family of Saltimbanquis is the sort of alienation that occurs in modern society. So the book says these homeless entertainers who eked out a living through their creative talents, existing on the margins of society, have long been understood as modernist surrogates for the artist. So through this barren landscape and through having these figures that don't really sort of interact and connect with one another, right? You have this female who looks off to the side longingly, and these other figures who all seem to not be looking at one another. It sort of stands as this alienation that people feel in modern society and not being able to connect. So psychologically withdrawn and uncommunicative in this sort of silent landscape. So sort of rethinking these ideas by Kirchner and this loneliness in society that continues to occur in sort of in the modern day with machines and sort of general feeling of alienation. So in 1905, Picasso meets Gertrude Stein, and she's living with her brothers Leo and Michael in Paris, and they're working to amass a sort of modern art collection at that time. And she introduced him to Matisse, and she was a famous author of her own. She had a lot of books that she was writing at the time, and she becomes quite famous in her own right. But she sat about 90 times for Picasso while he painted her. And this is sort of a very unconventional pose for a female sitter. She's very self-assured. She feels sort of very proclaimed and powerful. It's a very powerful female sitter expressing her sort of genuine artistic genius in her own right. She fills her corner of space like some powerful, massive work of sculpture. And so Picasso created this great portrait of her to really represent her as an individual and as an artist in herself. Later, he's going to go back and repaint the face, which is why you get this sort of lopsidedness of the two eyes that you can see here, but he's really sort of investing his time and energy into creating this powerful portrait of her. And you can see this other portrait by Felix Vallotton is painted only several months later. And you sort of get the difference between the two approaches. So here's Picasso moving to a more Cubist aesthetic that's soon to come, versus the right, where you have sort of a more realistic portrait of her. But she's very famous. Here's her with her portrait by Picasso, and going to produce a lot of books and scholarly sources of her own. So she's one of these artists that, although sort of a fictional, she was mostly writing in literature and not producing sort of modern art in the traditional sense. She hosted a Paris salon of her own, which featured leading figures in literature and art like Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis, Ezra Pound, Sherwood Anderson, and Henry Matisse. And she became famous for publishing her quasi-memoir, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which is actually her life partner. So she was in fact a lesbian, and her name is taken on by one of the Guerrilla Girls as sort of their anonymous name, misnomer. This book had such famous phrases like "a rose is a rose is a rose," and she has sort of a complicated life because she was able to sort of protect herself even though she was a Jew and stay in Europe, in Nazi-occupied France. During World War II, she had some protection from Nazi friends, as well as sort of having an in with some other figures. So she was able to stay there during World War II, but was a very important figure in literature and the modern art period as well. So we start to see Picasso being influenced by Greek sculpture and painting, and the studies of antiquities at the Louvre and the exhibition on Ingres' work, and starts producing sort of primarily nude figures like idealized women or adolescent boys, all kind of in this terracotta palette, which is very supposed to mimic this ancient Mediterranean terracotta imagery. And you see this kind of image where you have a woman that's kind of almost her mirror reflection, but not quite. And you see Picasso starting to get interested in primitivism and Gauguin. And we're going to see how that influences him with this painting here, which is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907. It is often called the single most important painting of the 20th century because it shattered every precedent pictorially as well as iconographically, which is poggers, right? It's this very powerfully aggressive image. It assaults the viewer, could even be called the first Cubist painting, and sort of combines this idea of expressionism as well. And it wasn't something that we see into later Cubism because they're not really producing that many multi-figure compositions. Nothing really stylized in this amount of fervor. So a lot of people are playing with this construct of prostitutes, but Picasso does it in even more of an explosive way with this massive painting. He encounters non-Western art in Paris museums and looking at African art from France's colonies displayed in African masks. And he bought some and kept them in his studio, and decides to paint prostitutes or demoiselles, which means young ladies, in Avignon, which is a red light district in Barcelona, and very much creates this work and is influenced by works like Ingres' Turkish Bath, as well as Cézanne's Bathers. I believe this is the one that we looked at in this class. The three left figures have sort of Iberian influence with their simplified features, wide almond eyes, and their bodies are reduced to this flat, simple, interlocking angular shapes. Even the curtains are hardened with threatening shards. You have the central figure showing classical Venus poses, while the others are twisted in these kind of uncomfortable, impossible positions, many in different angles and perspectives. You can kind of look down at this bowl of fruit, but then you have this woman who's turning all the way around and showing her head. It kind of has this weird emotional tenseness. And these two figures on the right have these African artistic mask faces, very much talking about this primitive cultures, which we'll talk about in just a second. The bodies are very fractured and flattened and very sexual with their hard glares and sharp mouths. Now, what we see in some of the studies that he was doing for this work, he was kind of depicting this whole scene that you have here that looks maybe a little more like something you might imagine occurring, where you have the far left is a figure of the artist identified as a medical student, a figure the artist identified as a medical student holding a book in the right arm and draws back the curtain with his left arm, which doesn't really look like his left arm. It's kind of disjunctured. It's staged like a setting. The student encounters a provocative quintet of naked women. All of them kind of theatrically open the curtains at the right, and they're surrounded by a lone sailor who is seated before a table holding a plate of spiky melons and a Spanish flask of wine. And you have this other second still life that occurs here in the front, which we lose in the final painting. The women seem very sexual, while the male clients are much more reserved as well. Here's some more studies of this painting. Like we talked about with primitivism and with Gauguin, Picasso's conflation of women's bodies, disease, violence, primitivism was, of course, far from idiosyncratic and very much kind of followed along these sort of primitive ideas of otherness, right? The creating of binaries, male and female, black, white, heterosexual and homosexual, and alterity as well. And what we have is that Picasso is engaging with this to create sort of cultural uncertainty. There was this sort of mixed feeling about some of the uprisings that were occurring in colonized nations, and creating these sort of very interesting, very tense idea, while also sort of using this idea of African masks and African culture as well. And this was in large part of the modern artists, like we've talked about with Gauguin and other artists, and we're going to still see it. And we see it even brought to life in this exhibition held in the 1980s, which was curated by William Rubin, where it showed modern pieces of art next to sort of African, oceanic, and native cultures to sort of compare and contrast these objects. And what we see again is that it's promoting this us versus them scenarios, and displaying these objects against modern art objects, which have wall labels, and it tells you what they are and what they're about, while these sort of quote-unquote primitive objects are just being shown for their aesthetic value. So not for their purpose, not where they are, not where they come from. It doesn't give you any idea of what these objects are. So this sort of thoughtless decontextualization of tribal objects through purposeful omission of discourses on their meaning and uses, instead strictly categorizing them as art, but as stated before, only when relevant to modern works. So this became a very controversial exhibition, and the curator acted like he was not doing it intentionally, but there's very much a sense of othering when you putting these objects with no contextualization next to these very sort of quote-unquote famous Cubist Western discourse objects, right? With like Picasso's guitar, Giacometti's work as well. Even to the extent that they were taking modern works and putting them side by side with masks that they could, quote unquote, potentially be compared to. And like, yes, obviously some of these ideas and inspirations make sense, but it's very much taking it to a one-dimensional idea of these objects, right? And thinking of them only in their aesthetic value, which very much sort of objectifies them in a very horrific way. And even in the 1980s, seeing an exhibition put on like this is very sort of far away from how we think about, far away from how we want to think about African objects versus modern art. Sort of nonsensical. We have to kind of admit that they were using it in this sort of very othering way. Sorry, I just moved my contact. I can't see. So again, going back to Gauguin and thinking about this otherness as well, and this sort of sexualization, objectification of the other. We are now moving on to Braque. He was 1 year younger than Picasso and was a descendant of amateur painters. And he very much begins with doing these trompe l'oeil collages, which means a representation of an object with such verisimilitude as to deceive the viewer concerning the material reality of the object. He moved to Paris and was inspired by the Louvre and Cézanne and started submitting work to the Salon and was inspired by Fauvism. And around this time, we're going to have him and Picasso's paths cross. Both started producing different works of art. So this is Viaduct at Les Astaques from 1907, oil on canvas. And both Picasso and Braque are considered part of Cézannist or Cézannism, in which they both really supported Cézanne's vision of art and the depiction of landscapes and images. And so, however, in this image, Braque really creates his own distinctive palette with bright coloration that's very sort of tame compared to his Fauvist contemporaries. However, the landscape is rigorously constructed and to make a palpable sense of volume. So instead of trying to depict linear perspective, I don't know how I was going to say linear landscape, linear perspective, or showing things in a perspective way that makes sense to the viewer, he uses weight and volume in the objects to show that they're moving back into space and that they have value. So, and he also did this by framing the canvas in trees here, which is something that Cézanne did as well. Braque didn't paint that many nudes, but he does have Picasso visit around 1907, and after visiting him, he starts to play with the human figure. And he's not as motivated by sexual themes as Picasso is, but he definitely wanted to create a new sense of beauty in terms of volume, line, and mass, and so he does start playing around with this construct a little bit in this work, Large Nude. Now you can see his work changed pretty drastically. So this is the same place that we just saw. So Viaduct at La Estaque moved to Houses at La Estaque in 1908. And here you have the houses and trees becoming so simplified that they become geometric volumes, experienced at a close angle and sealed off from surrounding sky or land. And the forms move forward instead of back, even though they have volume and move in all these sort of different landscapes. You have this interesting way that the forms move towards you. He's constructing a sense of space, but not constructing perspective correctly. And there's a belief that this is really one of the earliest Cubist paintings, not Desmossiers, but this one in particular, that he's really starting to invest himself in shape, in square, in cubing. When Braque does show this work to Picasso in 1908, he tries to submit it to the Salon, and it was rejected, with Matisse saying that this work was made out of little cubes, which is where Cubism got its name. So Picasso and Braque start spending a lot of time together, and in this particular work by Picasso, Three Women, after he starts working with Braque, he sort of reinvents this work and bring back some of the constructs of Les Desmossiers with the Venus figures, right? Again, we have these arms up over their heads. But instead, these women are even less fleshy than those in Les Desmossiers and come even more as sort of carved out of sandstone, right? You get sort of the hardness and the sharpness of the figures themselves. They look like they're made out of stone or something very sort of tangible instead of paint. You even have them using techniques of Cézannism, such as letting planes slip away and merge with adjacent areas, even so much that you could see in this figure's hip, there's this sort of triangle shape here, and her breast on the right sort of merges in with it. So it could be the shadow of her breast or the movement of her leg. So he sort of combines this idea that Cézanne sort of projected in his work as well. Here are the Venus figures from Les Demoiselles, if you forgot. Hopefully not. So this is really the time that Analytic Cubism is invented, 1910 to 1912. And it's this very short period. However, you have this Analytic Cubism where they're still focusing on the representation of objects and tradition, but recalibrating it and rethinking it in using shapes. For instance, the Cubists recognize that Renaissance linear perspective, in which spatial recession is illusionistically rendered on a two-dimensional surface by means of geometry, was simply one of many ways in which three-dimensional space might be translated into two dimensions. They believed that they could show space and volume through shape and contour and line, and so they really started to try to play with this concept in their own work. You can see Picasso really starting to learn and invest in the work of Braque when he starts to make landscapes in the Cubist form. So this is Houses on the Hill, Horta de Ebro. Here you have these stucco houses of the village seen from above, and piled into this sort of pyramidal structure of refinement and delicate coloration. You have this painting of pale and gold and gray, and creating again this prismatic world where mass and space are synonymous. And even the sky itself has shapes, right? It starts to look like you have this like kind of landscape or mountainscape in the background when the sky is just sort of making up of prisms like this. Braque is very invested in producing images of musical instruments. He was very much an amateur musician in his spare time, and in this image he placed his painting palette, some music as well, and then his violin. And so he's taking objects that already exist in space and breaking them down into geometric forms. So you still get the sense that you're representing the natural world. You have the palette that's being hung on the wall with a nail, and the nail is reflected onto the palette. So you have the shadow of the nail itself. And you can really see the violin still. You still see the handle and the curling of the scroll as well. So he's very much just taking these objects and breaking them down a little further. So he's really interested in taking objects that have weight and sort of rethinking this weight and volume in a different way. Picasso's doing this a little bit with musical instruments as well. This is Girl with a Mandolin. However, Picasso is still a little bit less revolutionary than Braque because he still has these organic shapes of the arms and of the neck, and so to some extent he's still holding some of the organic shape of the object. So it's really when in 1910 when you have Analytic Cubism come to its sort of full birth, in that Analytic Cubism, in which the object is analyzed, broken down, and dissected, is the term used to describe this high phase of their collaboration. They are working in such a competitive way that they produce some of the most cerebral, complex paintings of their careers, stopped even signing their works as they almost became indistinguishable from one another. So you have sort of the intensity of their collaboration that is producing Analytic Cubism and really bringing Picasso and Braque's work together. So the book focuses on two works of art in particular. To really talk about how these artists are almost indistinguishable from one another. So here you have one on the left is by Picasso, one on the right by Braque, and you could totally believe that it could be the other way around, but both of them are reordering the physical world in their composition, even though there's the presence of an actual human figure. So, for example, Here's Picasso's. It's Accordionist, 1911. He is representing a individual playing the accordion. It's a little girl, according to Picasso, and you can sort of make out a chair and sort of the keys of the accordion. So some of the keys are here, and this chair with the little scrolls at the end. And but it still has some of the representation of a figure in it. However, they're very much sort of dissolved into the background. He's using Seurat, little pointillist brushstrokes, as well as really breaking up the form in these cubist shapes so that it's almost indistinguishable from something that is represented in the physical world. So in this work, you have Picasso breaking down the figural form as well, and Braque doing the same thing with the Portuguese, the immigrants from 1911. And here in this image, Braque is representing an immigrant on a bridge of a boat with a harbor in the background. You can kind of get the sense of a harbor in the background here because you have a kind of a rope around the harbor on the right here. However, you don't see a lot of the figure. He's really breaking down the form. Again, similarly to Picasso's. You have him, Braque, starting to use words as well, which is going to become a popular technique of, why is this so far off? A popular technique of Cubism as well. So here you have D and ball, which stands for possibly Grand Ball, which is a poster that would have been up around the city of Paris at the time. But we're going to see them start to use sort of newspaper lettering in a lot of their work as sort of a collage technique. So they're both going to take it up and expand on it as we move into this sort of next movement of Cubism. So after Picasso and Braque's move into Analytic Cubism, they move into Synthetic Cubism from 1912 to the 1920s, very much adopting collage and the use of multiple mediums and materials, so not just painting in sort of the traditional way, but very much sort of using different everyday materials as part of collage. So, for example, with Picasso's still life with chair caning from 1912, you have him using sort of a complex array of pictorial vocabularies, and it's supposed to look like objects scattered across a cafe table. You have fragments of a journal that is often used in a lot of their work, Le Journal, which is the artist focusing on puns, could refer to jouer, meaning to play, implying the illusion of the game, of this kind of object that's supposed to look like it's a table, while it's a flat sort of surface. Other objects include a knife, a goblet, a slice of lemon, and a pipe. And he's also printed, has a printing of chair caning, but isn't real, it's a facsimile. So similar to the idea of sort of creating this collage and then using this sort of faux chair caning print, Picasso is playing with the idea that art is a lie that helps us understand the truth. And then he surrounded this work with rope, which is an ironic imitation of a golden frame, making this kind of read as the tabletop. He would also do this with bottles of work like Bottle of Suze, which is a pretty popular one by him, in which he took collage together to suggest a bottle of liquor with the label, as well as a glass and ashtray with cigarette and smoke, as you can kind of see here. The newspaper suggests popular Parisian cafe activity of reading the newspaper, juxtaposed. The newspaper articles that he used are about events from the First Balkan War, and sort of contrasting these news stories with sort of Parisian frivolity of drinking in a cafe and sort of being free-spirited bohemians. Braque was also playing with Cubist sculpture. We see a lot of sculpture as well that I'm not necessarily showing you in this presentation, but Picasso did play with it as well. Braque was making Cubist sculptures before he was even making paper collages, but he didn't want to keep them. He often threw them away and destroyed them. But this is one of those where he creates a sculpture out of paper, like a sort of standing collage. Pablo Picasso would take this and run with his maquettes for Qatar, Paris, 1912, in which he sort of created this 3D version of a collage into an image of a guitar, kind of looking like the mask that was seen in the Primitivist exhibition. But these sculptures can be completely arbitrary, and they don't necessarily often interact with reality. And we'll come back to Picasso again to look at his Guernica work, as he's affected by World War I and World War II. But I wanted to talk about the problems with Picasso as an artist, because as you may feel, as I could tell from sort of the groans of the class, is that Picasso is sort of a controversial artist, as you may or may not know. And I'm going to give you some reasons why and break it down sort of for you. And this is not something I've done before in class, but I think it kind of holds value as we start to think about some of these artists and their value in sort of the Western canon as a whole. Because we see that Picasso is such a strange character, and sort of the way that he treats his wives and girlfriends. And so I'm going to show you how sort of terrible it is at the core and kind of what kind of man, even though he was proclaimed as this sort of genius of Cubism and art, sort of what he did to the women and people in his life. So, of course, as I talked about, he kind of quote unquote stole Germaine, who was the girlfriend of his friend who killed himself. He also spoke poorly of Bertha Wheel, who was that first art collector. Was she an art collector or a gallery owner? First art dealer in history. So he calls her a homely Jewish spinster with spectacles thick as goldfish bowls, which is not necessarily a compliment, I would say. And what we see about Picasso's life is sort of the ins and outs of him using women as sort of inspiration for his work. And I'm going to sort of show you this and move through them, and you're going to sort of see how his relationships unfold. So, for example, Ferdinand Olivier was his first great love, and fell in love in 1904. She was a French artist and model who inspired part of Picasso's Rose period and Cubist paintings, and they had a tumultuous relationship that lasted about 7 years, and she ends up writing a memoir that he asks her not to publish until they're both dead, which is very strange, and we will see that being the case for many of his women as well. But he created some of these early paintings and Cubist paintings, like this one on the right of Olivier. You hear that she talks about him in this very sort of strange way. She kind of was ambivalent about Picasso's growing obsession with her. His eyes implore me. He watches religiously whatever I do. When I wake, I find him at the head of the bed, his eyes full of anguish fixed on me. While he was with Olivier, he started a relationship with Eva Goul, who was her friend, in about 1911, while he was still living with Olivier. He declared his love for her with his work Ma Jolie, and she ends up dying of tuberculosis in 1915, and we're going to come back to her. While he was in a relationship with Eva Goul and Olivier, he was also in a relationship with Gabrielle de Perret-Lespinasse. Again, my French is really horrific. While Goul was dying and while he was still living with Olivier, he was seeing this woman as well. And it was a secret for some time, but it came out that he was creating these watercolors in which he was writing sort of poetry to her. And so it came out eventually that he was indeed having a relationship with her while also having a relationship with these two other women. After his relationship with Lespinasse fell apart, Irene Lagoutte was his next victim. Unfortunately, he fell madly in love with her, and she was very famous, and he had fallen in love with her and asked his friend Apollinaire to help kidnap her and bring her back to Paris. She escaped, but apparently came willing a week later, which seems suspicious to me. But she continued to have an affair with Picasso, on and off, until they decided to get married. But she jilted him at the altar, and he would later create the work The Lovers for her. How very romantic. He next would meet his first wife. This is the one he officially married. She was a ballet dancer, Olga Koklova, and she was of noble descent, and they were married for about 10 years, but she filed for divorce after not being able to deal with sort of his numerous infidelities. And she stopped her ballet career while she was with him, and then did experience a leg injury. So she's often shown sitting in some of his work, which we will see here. And you can see on the left here as his paintings get a little more cubist in their representation. She has their first child, Paulo, and sort of eldest son. And as the relationship starts to get tumultuous and they move towards divorce, you can actually see Picasso's work get more and more monstrous in his depiction of her. Very angry, very sort of grotesque. And this is the case for many of his sort of mistresses and wives, that if their relationship went sour, that he would depict them in sort of these disjointed ways, like the one on the right here, nude in a red chair. But they would break up in 1935 while he was having a relationship with Marie-Therese Walker, and she would have his child in the same year that Koklova and him broke up and got divorced. Now, he met Walker and said, "You have an interesting face. I would like to do a portrait of you. I am Picasso." She was 17 years old at the time, and Picasso was 46. And they had their daughter, Maya. I have a picture of Maya in a moment. He was also doing some famous portraits of her, like this one, as well as this one here. Again, very much in this cubist style. Picasso was very much obsessed and devoted to Maya, his first daughter, and he spent a lot of time with her until sort of the last 10 or so years of Picasso's life, because his final wife keeps him secluded from very much of his old family, probably in fear that he was being sort of unfaithful, which was, of course, the case. But he did these sort of very fantastic paintings of Maya, which show sort of his dedication and love to her. And Maya, in looking back at them, said that a lot of them were outfits that she was wearing, and activities she was doing as a young child. This is him with her on the right. Here is Maya, who is the eldest daughter here, with his future children, Cloud and Paloma, which we'll talk about shortly. Who we'll talk about shortly. Dora Maar is another very famous mistress of Picasso. She was a French photographer, painter, and poet who was studying and being devoted to surrealism. We're going to look at her work. And she meets Picasso in 1935, so the same year that he had Maya. And she was very subversive and dark and glamorous in her work. And I find this photograph funny. She's on the far right here, and she looks absolutely bored out of her mind. She also was famous. She opened a photography studio of her own called Keffer Dora Maar, and produced many photographs as well. Picasso used her as a muse, as you can imagine. This is a portrait of her as well. But he refused to break off his relationship with Walter, and I'm pretty sure her last name is Walker. I will double check. He seems to have taken a perverse thrill in making them compete for his affections, describing a story where they came to blows in his studio as one of my choicest memories. Having initially painted Mara as a nymph or a bird, his portraits began to show her tears, notably the excruciating weeping woman, now in the Tate's permanent collection. Picasso was also abusive to Mara, physically as well as emotionally, which seemed to be a trend amongst his relationship with women, which did end up causing her to have a mental breakdown in 1943. What I think is really fantastic and interesting that's kind of ignored often about these women, as they've been kind of pushed in the corner by Picasso's sort of great genius, is that they were really phenomenal artists in their own right. So Dora Maar being one of them, was this really phenomenal surrealist photographer. And luckily, a lot of these dialogues have come back, that people have been starting to put on exhibitions of her work, because she really has this very sort of fantastic view of surrealist photography, and she's even kind of engaging in Cubism, as well as being photographed in fashion museums or fashion magazines as well. So she's this really phenomenal artist in her own right, and we don't even really talk about her other than sort of as the muse of Picasso, even though I find her work really fascinating and gorgeous. So I'll include some links to her work so you guys can sort of read about it. But her photography is very fantastic and dark and surrealist. This is her work that looks very cubist. This one totally blows my mind. I don't know what this is at all. I did not spend a time researching every one of these works, because you'd never get this presentation back from me. The next artist who also married Picasso was Francoise Gilot, who was very famous because she was 22 years old, and he was 62 when they were married. So, or not, they never got married, I'm sorry. 62 when they met, so 40 years apart. He was still married to Kokolova at this time, so this is 43. And Gilot and Picasso had an intellectual attraction that led to romance, and they kept their relationship secret, but they eventually did open it up and make people aware as well, even though obviously Picasso continued to have other relationships. They did have two children, Paloma and Claude, which show up in a lot of the photographs that we were just looking at before. But Francois grew tired of his abuse and affairs and left him in 1953. And she wrote a book about her life with Picasso. And that ended up actually getting her children disinherited, which we'll talk about. But she went on to have a life of her own with Jonas Salk, who developed the first vaccine against polio. But again, this is another woman who is an artist in her own right and in her own sort of work that's very sort of developed in Cubism as well as abstraction. And she's still alive today and creating work. So she's 99 now. I do have a video of her talking about her journals. But a lot of her work is very interesting and powerful and not talked about, except as sort of Picasso's sidekick. There's her here at 98, but this was last year. So his final wife is Jacqueline Roch. In 1953, he meets her, and she became his second wife in 61. Picasso was 79 and she was 34. He created a bunch of works on her as well, as you can imagine, in using women as his frequent muses. And he painted her until he died in 1973. Now, Jacqueline prevented his children Paloma and Claude from attending the funeral because he had disinherited them, and she did commit suicide, actually, right before said she was going to come to one of Picasso's last exhibitions, which is quite strange. But of course, during his relationship with Roch, he was still having relationships with other women, like 19-year-old Sauvette David. Again, remember, he is 79 when he is painting her, and married to Roch. So what we find about Picasso, and sort of our frequent dialogue about him today, is that Picasso really kind of, quote unquote, bled the woman in his life dry. He used them for art, he used them as his muses, and then discarded them once he was bored and tired of them. Not only sort of emotionally and physically abusing them, but also sort of abusing them for his own power and artistic expression. Also, why is he always photographed with his shirt off? I don't understand. Marina Picasso, one of Picasso's granddaughters, said that he needed blood to sign each of his paintings. My father's blood, my brother's, mother's, grandmother's, and mine. He needed the blood of those who loved him. Even thinking back to Gilot's Life with Picasso from 1964, in which she talked about the way that he treated her, and treated her children by disinheriting them because she was the only woman who ever left him in his entire life, and stood up to him. After Jacqueline Roch, Picasso's second wife, barred much of the family from the artist's funeral. The family fell into pieces. Pablito, Picasso's grandson, drank a bottle of bleach and died. Paulo, Picasso's son, died of a deadly alcoholism born of depression. Marie-Therese Walter, Picasso's young lover, between his first wife, Olga Koklova, and his new mistress, Dora Maar, later hanged herself. Even Roch eventually fatally shot herself. Women are machines for suffering, Picasso told Francoise Gilot, his mistress after Maar. After they embarked on their affair when he was 61 and she was 21, he warned Gilot of his feelings once more. For me, there are only two kinds of women, goddesses and doormats. Marina saw her grandfather's treatment of women as an even darker phenomenon, a vital part of his creative process. He submitted them to his animal sexuality, tamed them, bewitched them, ingested them, and crushed them onto his canvas. After he had spent many nights extracting their essence, once they were bled dry, he would dispose of them. And it's crazy to me that even today, some people sort of say that he had some kind of respectful, positive relationship with these women, even though he continually treated and mistreated them. Gertrude Stein doing that in her autobiography. But I think there is a part that her work is fictional. He was also her friend. Maybe she was defending him at sort of any cost. But I've given you sort of numerous stories here as well, that as Olivier became sick, or Koklova became sick, or Gilot was sick, he would often leave the woman for another lover. If they were sick, if they were uninteresting, he would lose interest. Even having Koklova follow him around at some point, people saying she was mad, and sort of being neurotic about the way that he had treated her. And it's crazy to think that someone who is so powerful and strong at this time, and even today with Picasso being sort of this genius of modern art, that he's been able to sort of get away without this dialogue becoming sort of more prominent and powerful in even art historical textbooks, because it's something that people say, oh, well, he said women are either goddesses or doormats, and maybe that's funny. But he was obviously a physically and verbally abusive man to the women in his life. Emma Solkowitz did a protest recently. They're well known for their Columbia University protest, where they carried around a mattress after the campus didn't handle their sexual allegations appropriately. And so Solkowitz went around the Metropolitan Museum protesting works after it came out that Chuck Close was accused of making crude comments to his female models, and the Met said that they would put an asterisk next to people's names in the gallery that had sort of committed sort of sexual offenses against women, and Solkowitz believed that that was not enough, right, to reduce women's lives to an asterisk. So Solkowitz walked around with asterisks on their body and stood in front of Chuck Close's paintings, as well as Picasso's Les Demoiselles, saying, Picasso's main conceit are these lines that chop up women's bodies. It's kind of dismembering bodies to rearrange them as more visually appealing. Continue to think about how you feel about Picasso. We'll talk about him after the midterm. Obviously, his connection with modern art is important, but we also have to be aware of sort of what that kind of dialogue encourages as a whole. So I will see you guys next week for your midterm.